Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Sergeant Andrew M. Chandler, he's pictured here on the left, wrote a narrative about his experience at the Battle of Chickamauga in 1894 for Confederate Veteran magazine. He began his writing of the horrible, bloody waste that the battle wrought on that Northwest Georgia battlefield in September 1863 this way. Quote, I was engaged in the Battle of Chickamauga, belonged to the 44th Mississippi Regiment, Patton Anderson's brigade, Hindman's division. End quote. The highlight of Andrew's story occurred on the second day of the battle after he participated in a charge that resulted in the capture of a Union artillery battery. In this charge, he wrote, our brigade, which fought under the command of Major General Thomas C. Hindman, broke the Federal line and drove them nearly 1 mile when we were recalled and reformed and marched back to the old field, which was literally covered with dead and wounded Yankees. End quote. The Federals had sent more troops to fight the Mississippians. As the Bluecoats converged on their position, Andrew recalled an exchange that he had with General Hindman, a dapper dresser bursting with aggression from his 5'1" frame. Quote, General Hindman stopped his horse in rear of our company when I said to him, General, we are the boys to move them. He replied, you are, sir. We were then ordered to the foot of a long ridge, heavily wooded. After remaining there, lying down for some 20 minutes, the Yankees charged our brigade. End quote. Andrew abruptly ended his battle narrative here. He did not describe the rest of the attack, which was telling because during the fighting, at this time, a bullet tore into his right leg and ankle and took him out of action. But Andrew's military records and an anecdote passed down through the family over the following century and a half filled in the rest of the story. A surgeon, it turns out, examined 19-year-old Andrew as he lay on the battlefield, determined the wound serious, and sent him to a makeshift hospital. Soon afterward, Andrew was joined by Silas, a family slave, 7 years his senior. Silas sits here next to Andrew in this wartime image. In the hospital, according to family history, surgeons decided that the injured leg could not be saved and decided to amputate. Then Silas stepped in. As one of Andrew's descendants explained, quote, Silas distrusted army surgeons. Somehow he managed to hoist his master into a convenient boxcar, end quote. They rode the rails to Atlanta, where Silas sent a request for help to Andrew's relatives. An uncle came to their assistance and brought both men home to Palo Alto, Mississippi, where they had started out 2 years earlier. When the war had broken out in 1861, Andrew enlisted in the Palo Alto Confederates, a local military company that eventually joined the 44th Mississippi. Andrew's concerned mother, Louisa, sent Silas, one of her 36 enslaved people, off to war with him. Thousands of enslaved men served in their masters and masters' sons in the Confederate Army before and after President Abraham Lincoln, whom a number of Southerners referred to as the Black Republican, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Many of these men, these enslaved servants, remained with their owners throughout the war. Silas had known nothing but slavery his entire life. Born into bondage on the Chandler plantation in Virginia, he moved with the family to Mississippi when he was about 2 years old. He was trained as a carpenter, and the Chandlers brought in extra income by hiring Silas out to locals in need of his skills. It was a common practice in the antebellum South. The money that Silas earned by his labor was paid to the Chandlers, who gave him a small portion. According to a story passed down through Silas's descendants, he saved the pennies he received in a jar that he hid in a barn for safekeeping. Around 1860, Silas wed Lucy Garvin in a slave marriage which was not recognized by law. She was a light-skinned woman and the illegitimate daughter of a mulatto house slave named Polly and an unnamed plantation owner. She was classified as an octoroon, or 1/8 African, which determined her legal status in the United States. The next year, Silas bid his newlywed wife farewell and went to war with Andrew. He shuttled back and forth from encampments in Georgia and elsewhere to the plantation in Mississippi to procure and deliver much needed supplies to Andrew. No account exists that Silas ever attempted to flee to Union held territory. At the Battle of Chickamauga, the 44th went into action with 272 men and suffered 30% casualties, including Andrew. According to the Chandler family, Silas accompanied him to Mississippi. Quote, a hometown doctor prescribed less drastic measures and Mr. Chandler's leg was saved, end quote. It's according to the family. Andrew was able to do Silas's service as well, noted the family in another story that was passed down. During one campaign, Silas constructed a shelter for himself from a pile of lumber, so the story goes. A number of calloused Confederate soldiers attempted to take Silas's shelter away from him, and when he resisted, they threatened to take his life. At this point, Andrew Chandler and a friend of his named Cal Weaver came to Silas's defense and threatened the marauders with some kind of treatment, or the same kind of treatment they offered Silas, the threat of death. This closed the argument. Andrew's Chickamauga wound ended his combat service, but Silas went back to the front lines with Andrew's younger brother Benjamin, who had enlisted in the 9th Mississippi Cavalry in January of 1864, just a few months after Andrew was wounded. Silas accompanied the younger Benjamin and the rest of the 9th as they skirmished with advanced elements of Major General William Tecumseh Sherman's army through Georgia and the Carolinas. Then, during the Confederacy's final days, Benjamin and a detachment of his fellow Mississippians joined the military escort that guarded President Jefferson Davis as he and his entourage fled Richmond. By the time Davis reached Georgia, fears that the large escort would draw the attention of numerous Union patrols crisscrossing the countryside in search of him prompted commanders to act. On May 7th, 1865, most of the escort was disbanded. Davis continued to ride south with a much smaller and less conspicuous guard. Benjamin and Silas were part of that group ordered to disband on May 7th. 3 days later, on May 10th, Benjamin Chandler surrendered to the Federals near Washington, Georgia. Silas was by his side when the surrender occurred. That same day, President Jefferson Davis was captured about 175 miles south in the Georgia village of Irwinsville. Silas returned home and reunited with Lucy. They eventually had 12 children, 5 of whom lived into adulthood. Silas became a carpenter in the Mississippi town of West Point, and he taught the trade to at least 4 of his sons. Quote, they built some of the finest houses in West Point, end quote, noted a family member who added that Silas and his boys constructed houses, churches, banks, and other buildings throughout the state. Silas lived within a few miles of his former masters, the Chandler brothers. In 1868, Silas and other freedmen constructed a simple Baptist altar near a cluster of bushes on land adjacent to property owned by Andrew and his family. The freedmen soon replaced it with a wood-frame church, and in 1896, one of Silas's sons participated in the construction of a new church on the same site. In 1888, Mississippi established a state pension program for Confederate veterans and their widows. African Americans who had acted as slave servants to soldiers in gray were also allowed to participate. Overall, 1,739 men of color were on the pension rolls as servants to Confederate soldiers, including Silas. Benjamin from the 9th Mississippi Cavalry died in 1909. Silas passed away in September 1919, 10 years later, at age 82. Andrew, pictured here, survived Silas by only 8 months, dying in May of 1920. Flash forward to 1994, the Sons of Confederate Veterans and United Daughters of the Confederacy conducted a ceremony at the gravesite of Silas in recognition of his Civil War service. An iron cross and flag were placed next to his monument. The event of placing those Confederate markers next to the gravesite prompted mixed reactions from descendants of Silas and Andrew. Silas's great-granddaughter, Myra Chandler Sampson, denounced the ceremony as, quote, an attempt to rewrite and sugarcoat the shameful truth about parts of our American history, end quote. She added that Silas, quote, was taken into a war for a cause he didn't believe in. He was dressed up like a Confederate soldier for reasons that may never be known, end quote. But Andrew Chandler Battle, great-grandson of Andrew, met Myra's brother Bobby Chandler at the ceremony in 1994. He saw the experience a bit differently. It was truly as if we had been reunited with a missing part of our family. Bobby Chandler, for his part, accepted the role his great-grandfather played in the Confederate Army. He observed, history is history. You can't get by it. So that's the story of Silas Chandler, pictured here, with Andrew Chandler. I'll give you one other aside to all of this. The photograph that you see here was originally owned by the family, by Andrew's family. Andrew Chandler Battle, who I mentioned in the story, was the owner and representative of the family. It was in their possession. And this image, some of you students of the Civil War may recognize. It appeared on an episode of Antiques Roadshow. And at the time, I was working on a book about Confederate soldiers, and I reached out to the Roadshow to get contact information for Andrew Chandler Battle. Well, they gave me the contact information, and it turned out that Mr. Battle lived not far from me, and we decided to meet for lunch in Washington, D.C. At that lunch, I asked him if I could scan the image and also have permission to publish it in the book. While we're at lunch in a restaurant in downtown Washington, D.C., he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a copy of the photograph. And I said, well, I appreciate that, but I actually need to scan the original because I'm a stickler for having original digital scans in any books that I publish. And so Andrew reached into his briefcase and then pulled out the image that you see here. He handed it to me and he said, I trust you with it. I'd only known him for about 2 hours, but we had a good bond and he trusted me. And I had to make the trip home from the restaurant in Washington, D.C. to my home, going on the metro, going through crowded city, crowded downtown, holding this image. I stuck it into my briefcase and pretty much held my briefcase close to my chest. Part of the reason I did so was not only because this particular image is so incredibly unique, I also knew the insurance value because I had seen the episode on the Roadshow. And that insurance value was $35,000. So I was about as nervous as one could possibly be as I made my way through DC. Not too long after that, the image made its way into the Library of Congress and is now part of the Liljenquist family collection there. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.